Namaskar. Was United States fair to the Afghan people? Were they fair when they just left Afghanistan and allowed Taliban to invade that country? A lot of people say that, listen, you know what can United States do? Afghanistan government should have handled it, and Afghanistan army should have handled it. What can United States do beyond a point? Someone else would say that, listen, you know what? United States was not invited by Afghanistan to their country to meddle into their affairs. They went on their own. And when things were over, their need was over, they walked out. Now, let's understand this from a US perspective. I have two very eminent guests, both of them US citizens, but both Indian. I have Satish Jha, who is the co-founder of Janasata, senior journalist, expert political analyst. And I have Shantanu. Shantanu is said to be one of the brightest mind when it comes to geopolitics and strategies. Let's talk to these two gentlemen and understand the American perspective. Let's get right into the show. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, both you gentlemen, for joining me. I'll get directly into the questions, Jasab. Jasab, and I'll start with you. Sir,
thank you. Sure.
Okay. Did US let down Afghanistan?
I think that, in my opinion, history of US post-World War has been letting down itself on every intervention it engages in. Same thing happened everywhere. You look at the history of US after World War II. World War II was a great success story. It built the modern world. But since then, I think the wars were not the wars that were needed. They were wars of choice. And wars of choice are picked up when you want to, and you abandoned when the new leadership wants to. And because US has a 4-yearly presidential process, so every new president can make up his own policy or her own policy. We haven't seen a woman one. But in this case, Trump undid 4 years, during 4 years, 8 years of Obama policies. So Biden was basically pursuing the Trump's last agreement with Taliban. And the question is, he's not being questioned on the quality of policy. He's being questioned on the implementation of that policy. And so I would say that this abandonment from the US is part of its trajectory that I've seen in the past post-World War. Everywhere it's gone, it let them down, be it Iran, except Israel. That's the only, steadfast relationship it has had so far. So I look at that as the American evolution since the World War II. They are not the most trusted allies of any nation because they pursue something called self-interest, which is defined in the 4-year term of each president.
Absolutely. Shantanu, my question is that they say that America has only one interest, that is their own. Is it true?
I think that actually what the Afghanistan situation shows is that the interests of the US military, the interests of the US executive, and the interests of the US people are completely misaligned. Just speaking briefly about the past of Obama, Trump, and Biden, just on the issue of Afghanistan, it was Obama who began the process of trying to retreat from Afghanistan. However, the generals, particularly Petraeus, McChrystal, and at the time Mike Mullen, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, engaged in the illegal leaking of information to Bob Woodward, amongst other journalists, largely for the purpose of manipulating and browbeating Obama into maintaining troops in Afghanistan and then in creating the surge. I think actually watching this is part of what convinced Biden that he couldn't necessarily follow military advice. We saw Donald Trump go through much the same thing, where throughout his tenure, he was trying to withdraw troops not merely from Afghanistan, but also from Iraq and various other wars the US is conducting. So it seems to me that the wars are prosecuted with a definite self-interest in mind. The question is whose, because it doesn't seem to be that of the executive branch or of the electorate necessarily. It seems to be the self-interest of the military-industrial complex, as President Eisenhower called it.
Mr. Jha, Biden says if Afghan doesn't want to, or the Afghan army doesn't want to fight this war, why do we? Isn't he right in a way?
As a matter of fact, I think Afghans got too used, comfortable with having American forces there. And the fact does remain. Running a nation is the job of the people of that nation. It is not the job of another country as such. In normal circumstances, America would have been seen as occupying force in that sense. But the fact that in the past 3 years, there were so few casualties in Afghanistan, and the last year, apparently, there was none whatsoever, that put some kind of a lull in the way they thought about Afghan capability to handle itself. That clearly was not well understood. Information was clearly not infiltrated very well. And what we are seeing is, I am totally with Biden. No nation should have to ask another nation to come and help them in running themselves. But this was a war of choice for George Bush. And before that, there were 7 presidents of the US, Jimmy Carter onwards. They've been totally engaged in Afghan. In the beginning, it was fighting Russia. So that was the challenge, the Cold War era, that Russia and US entered Afghanistan. It followed through Reagan. Reagan basically had, in his 8-year term, his views evolved over a period of time. But George Bush Jr., he was the one who actually led to a level of escalation of engagement for whatever reasons. Osama bin Laden became a reason. But just imagine, $2,000 billion is spent on war in 20 years in a country which has a $20 billion GDP. Were there no better ways of handling it? So I would say, yes, I am with Biden's perspective that nations should manage their own affairs. At the same time, it also has other side of it. Then other nations should not by choice enter this nation also. American presence in Afghanistan was not Afghan choice. That was a choice America made for Afghanistan. That's where Biden is trying to differentiate himself, or at least pivot, or segue from the previous presidents. One thing he said a couple of things he said very interesting. I don't want the next president to carry on with the same questions the previous 6 have struggled. Well, that's decisive. Some people can say he was very bold about it because, you're fighting the military that got used to spending $2,000 billion in 20 years. That's a lot of money. That can create its own interest. Some can say he was very brave, but everyone has denounced him. Everyone, all his friends and allies. I don't find a single voice who supports Biden in the way it's been done.
A fact, yeah. I mean, Biden took a bold step. Imagine the chaos he left behind. Imagine the dead bodies that he left behind. What about that? Who's going to answer for that?
That itself is a very interesting question. I think there's no question that in U.S. politics, the buck stops with the president, as Harry Truman said. And so Biden has to take some pressure for this. But the reality is also that execution is the responsibility of the military. The original Trump agreement with the Taliban lasted until May 1st. Biden asked for an extension so that his team, starting with Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, would have more time to plan. There seems to have been no planning whatsoever done. The chaos began with the abandonment of the Bagram airfield, 50 miles north of Kabul, which was the most natural evacuation point, since Kabul International Airport only has one runway and is near a civilian population that, as we've seen, was liable to engage in a recapitulation of the sad scenes of Saigon from so long ago, attaching themselves to airplanes. This was done without much thought at a time when, after 20 years fighting, the United States has still not been able to secure the 2-mile road between the Kabul airport and the embassy. So I think ultimately the military has to answer for this. Lloyd Austin, who's the Secretary of Defense, was a member of CENTCOM, the U.S. Central Command. He would know the region intimately, and he hasn't given any answers as to why Bagram was abandoned and why Kabul, which is on a natural choke point, would become the centerpiece of a chaotic evacuation.
This question is to both of you gentlemen. American intelligence had warned that within 90 days of the troop pulling out, Taliban would invade Afghanistan. America was aware of that. So what? They allowed it to happen?
No, it's not that. Ultimately, the decision rests with the president. Having said that, there are multiple agencies in the US government. Just imagine there are 17 intelligence agencies. And the president's role is to basically balance out whatever information he gets, along with the positions of perspective he has developed for himself or herself. In this case, Biden is known for, he's a foreign policy wonk in some ways. For 40 years, he was in the Senate. For half of his tenure, chairing the Foreign Policy Committee. He has had a perspective, and then he was vice president for 8 years. So there is no one who is more of an insider, who understands every single perspective. Now, the question is to take a decision based on all the information you get, as well as to make sure that it represents the policy of the administration. That is the presidential responsibility. So President took that decision. Either he remains a senator in some ways, essentially. A senator can debate but can't really act. But I thought he was also vice president for 8 years, where he learned how to be an executive. So between senatorial skill and executive imperative, that balance somehow got missed out. That's what I'm seeing here.
But for all this, the people of Afghanistan paid, isn't it?
No, I think Afghanistan would have paid even if America had not entered. They've been paying forever. So the question is, the $2,000 billion invested in this war in 20 years, which is every year 5 times the GDP of Afghanistan. Clearly, about majority of that will be spent on equipment and U.S. forces, etc. But even if you say 20% entered Afghanistan, that should have doubled the per capita GDP of Afghanistan. So if they wanted to make a success out of it, they would have done that. But the corruption of the leadership of Afghanistan. Look, in the end, a nation has to blame itself. There's no one else to blame for it. But they can always say that the US came to destroy us, but they also gave more money than they've ever seen. And that money was picked up by the elite of Afghanistan. Whatever they did, we don't quite know. But corruption was the major issue here. And the demoralization, demotivation of the forces, because people, you see, the person who is an aggressor is very passionate about their goal. And the people who get used comfortable, they lose that sense of passion and ability to handle things. That's what the essence of guerrilla warfare's winning is, that you basically take the dominant enemy, the one who is sitting there by surprise. And that's what is happening here. That US said that 300,000 forces that we have trained in Afghanistan over a period of time, they can handle Afghanistan. And the 60,000 to 75,000 Talibanese forces, they are no match either in terms of preparedness or equipment, military devices, and whatever you need to handle Afghanistan. They can easily take care of it. Everything Biden thought was right turned out to be totally wrong. I mean, I've never seen a situation where every single statement President made a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 2 months before, they all turned out to be wrong in terms of predictions. So that's the challenge I'm facing. It's not the Afghanistan people who actually have suffered. They could have gained, a part of them gained like never before.
Shantanu, let's get into the geopolitical consequences. China, Pakistan have come together to support the Taliban. So what really has happened is this region has become unstable all of a sudden. Obviously, this recent development is not going to help United States, because neither is Pakistan now and neither was China ever friendly to United States. What happens from here?
Yes, I think it's quite clear that China intends to take full advantage of this. Almost coeval with the events in Afghanistan, we've seen the rise of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, the coronation of Port Gwadar, which is their crown jewel in what they're hoping will be a supply chain leading from the Middle East through Pakistan into China. And of course, the great prize in Afghanistan is the rare earth metals there. This is about $1 to $3 trillion on Pentagon estimations of rare earth metals. Of particular value there will be lithium and praseodymium. These are metals that are highly important, especially for green technologies, and as well as broad higher technologies such as chip development. So most of those resources already lie with China. And it's already been a major issue for the United States that it doesn't have nearly sufficient supply of most of these things and is in fact importing them from China. That problem is likely to get much worse. China has won an essentially bloodless victory, largely because of the fashion in which the US has had to retreat here.
What do you think is the social and political ramification as far as the United States is concerned?
You see, US concerns were primarily around what they believe in or they understand the world to be like. So they have a certain image of how the world should become. And they think the rest of the world, particularly Afghanistan, they're seen as tribals essentially. So their biggest concern is the 50% women, how will they be treated by Afghan Taliban forces? Because Taliban are known as a body that those who don't like women to learn, they don't like girls going to school. Image of Malala still remains in people's minds. And so that is one big challenge that America is trying to grapple with, that we have abandoned the population of the nation which we bombed and became ally of for the last 20 years, with women going to be the biggest victim. Second is the people who supported the Americans. They are going to be at the receiving end of the process. They could be tortured, killed, given really horrible treatment by the winning forces of Taliban. That is second concern. Third is how to evacuate Americans who are there anyway. Outside of that, of course, it's a largely academic or a question of what you can discuss on TV or classrooms. So that is a different story. From a strategic and state policy point of view, US is debating these questions because they are being discussed in the political arena. And to that extent, someone has to take interest in that, whether no one is accountable here, no one is responsible for those questions, but they reverberate here as such. How a nation handles itself, their question was around democracy. But democracy, the 6th January has shown that even in America, democracy is something you struggle for it every day and you have to work hard for it. So that is the question of the nation, that they have to build their own democratic environment as such. And on development, that is another issue that they have had. But clearly, Afghanistan is a kind of society. If after all this, they still at a $500 per capita income compared to about roughly $2,000 for India, even Africa's average is almost about $2,000 if you average it out. Ranges from about $4,500 to about $3,500 or something like that. But the average is around $2,000 for Africa as well. So Afghanistan is operating at 1/4 of per capita income of Africa. So you can understand the poverty there. Those are the questions. Having said that, they will not occupy the minds of American leadership.
Shantanu, I want to stick to the socio-political environment currently. And as an American citizen, how do you feel? What is your opinion? Handing over a country to oppressive force, a force that is absolutely seen as a group of people who oppresses women, oppresses economic empowerment to women, forget economic empowerment. How do you see this as an American citizen?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that we have to remember what the demographic makeup of Afghanistan is. Afghanistan is approximately 99.7% Muslim. Of that preponderating group of Muslims, 99% support Sharia law. Essentially, we're saying that at most 1% of the Afghanistani population was interested in having the kind of secular government that the US was backing in that country. So from a socio-political perspective and a democratic perspective, something like the Taliban may in fact be what, at scale, the people of Afghanistan really want. We have to remember that the Taliban came to power largely because they stood up to what we now call the Northern Alliance of Warlords, who were notorious pedophiles who frequently took young boys and girls from their villages. So the Taliban stood up to them, frequently killed them, and took the country back and instituted law and order. They didn't build hospitals and they didn't build schools, but they kept basic security, something the US failed to do. So from the perspective of the people of Afghanistan, because even this government in Afghanistan complained to the US, you're building too many hospitals and too many schools that no one wants or needs. This may actually be something closer to what the people as a whole there want. They have to make their own decision as a population.
Right from 1990s, this population of Afghanistan has been going against Taliban. I mean, they were not happy when Taliban took power or grabbed power in 1990s. And even today, you see a lot of people are against Taliban. They're standing against Taliban. So are you, Mr. Jha, do you think that the people of Afghanistan really wants Taliban?
I'm not making any judgment on what they do or do not want. What I'm saying is that as a country, it's ultimately their responsibility to make those judgments and make those decisions themselves. The Taliban did come to power with a large base of popular support. Certainly, some of their policies remain quite popular with the population at large. But at the end of the day, we have to ask, is it the responsibility of the United States to make these decisions for the people of Afghanistan? And the answer that President Biden, I think, correctly has come to is that it isn't.
Like Mr. Jha earlier mentioned, that the decision of America intervening in Afghanistan issues were also not a decision that the Afghans took. It was a decision Americans took. So somewhere down the line, there is a certain amount of responsibility, isn't it, Shantanu?
I'm not saying the Americans don't bear responsibility for what has occurred. But I'm saying that even if the Americans bear responsibility to help the population of Afghanistan, perhaps to save those who helped them, and to honor the relationships they established. But that's very different from saying that the United States has an obligation to decide what the government of Afghanistan is and what its policies ought to be.
Mr. Jha,
I would say that the issue with the US is US governments may make a certain decision, but a decision only reflects the choices we make. It doesn't mean that the whole hues of various opinions don't exist. Opinions from being very, very, what you call, bleeding heart about it, to being very military oriented about it. The two in between, the whole range of opinions, they exist. And the decisions are made based on what is relevant at a certain point in time. And when things bubble up to a point that you can't avoid, that's when you end up taking a decision. So it's not a considered, well thought of decision. It's something which gets done because the balance of forces come together and you drive them in one direction. That's how the Afghan war began. Across the US, there are whole hues of political opinions that exist, from bleeding heart liberals all the way to people who are diehard military industrial complex guys who want to make hay out of every situation possible. In between, there are many other opinions, but the choices are made at certain points in time. Those points in time are when balance of forces converge in a certain direction. That's how, at one point in time, a president decided to go to Afghan war and almost at no notice. And similarly, a president decides at a very short notice to pull out of it, because these choices are being made in a larger domestic and political context. And that's what's happening here. So I would say that US does bear the burden, because if you have made a decision to go to a nation, then you could have, you bear some responsibility. And that responsibility they have always tried to escape, because are you a force for good? Are you a force basically that goes only for either oil or rich minerals or some other reasons? Or is it your democratic values, or is it your morals that take you there? These are the questions which each president has to answer, and ultimately is an executive choice. The democracy has always been the kind of rallying cry in some ways for America to go everywhere, but that has not been a consistent force, if you see, all across, particularly since Nixon. Because once he said America has only one interest, and that's self-interest, that became the lens through which America got seen ever since. And I would say that in this case, America must bear some burden, but it just doesn't know how to handle that. It's totally exiting it. So it's the question of Afghanistan, what they made out of the $2,000 billion of bombs and schools and hospitals, whatever. How do they become part of current or contemporary human evolution or human progress? That is a choice Afghans have to make. Will it be, in the short run, awful for some people? Yes. In the long run, will it give them a choice? They have their own trajectory to basically follow. The challenge is that Afghan, for whatever reasons, by the way, if you saw in 1980, Cold War, Afghan was in the middle of USSR conflict. If US had remained, it was one point where China, US, and USSR all three met, USSR being Russia, but Russia was not there. So basically the remnants of USSR would have met in some ways. It's no longer the backyard of Russia. So in that sense, it would have been a playground of China versus US. So you have to see its strategic importance. It currently is more important for China than US. And that's what balance of forces have finally pushed things in that direction. That's how I see things emerging and various forces of contemporary geopolitics coming together to find a pathway. So it's a kind of an exit from the current situation. Is it going to be highway? That's something to be seen.
Shantanu, what is the geopolitical consequences for India?
So India is in an interesting situation. I think broadly speaking, their position is going to reflect that of Russia, actually. Just to recapitulate, the Russian situation is that the Russians have always been, like the US, fundamentally aligned with the Northern Alliance of warlords rather than with the Taliban. The reason for this is that the Russians have their own problem with Salafist separatists, especially in the Chechen area, as well as, broadly speaking, the Caucasus. So they're not necessarily happy about a Sunni Salafist regime like the Taliban coming to power. New Delhi is likely, the foreign ministry in New Delhi is likely to take a very similar position on this, where they are not happy about the rise of another Salafist regime, which will be looking to expand. But I think the real risk for India is actually the same as the risk for the US, which is the rise of China in the context, again, of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. Port Gwadar was a port that I think India, under Nehru, quite easily could have had and then gave away essentially for a pittance. This is a decision that is likely to be quite painful for India in the future, because Port Gwadar gives China and accordingly Pakistan an unprecedented level of power over what's going to become the new major supply chain for rare earth minerals through Central Asia and the Middle East.
What do you think are the specific economic issues that India is going to face in the future because of this?
I don't think there will be any direct macroeconomic issues. The issues will come about at the point at which India begins to consider its path of industrialization. At some point, India is likely to consider, what will our evolution into being an ecologically conscious country focused on green technology, what is that going to look like, just as China is making that transition right now? And that transition is going to be made very difficult because many of the relevant substrates are going to be held by two of your greatest regional enemies, Pakistan and China.
Mr. Jha, I want to ask you a very strategic question. The rise of Taliban, is that going to have any difference to the Modi administration, or especially
I think
Modi popularity?
Yes. If you look at it in some ways, the CAA that Modi government brought out has apparently some sense of what may happen vis-a-vis Afghanistan. Having said that, it is going to create a new dynamics because of it's a victory for Pakistan that was unimaginable just some time back. And that will create its own dynamics, and pressure will come from the Pakistan side because it's a Pakistan, Afghanistan, China nexus. That will put a lot of pressure on Modi government, no matter what he thinks in terms of its ability to have conversation with both China and Pakistan. Afghanistan is not as relevant in itself as it's a kind of leverage point in dealing with the two neighborly countries and or looking at the minerals that Shantanu talked about, and or some of the strategic advantages it offered us in dealing with the neighbors and so on and so forth. But those are marginal compared to the pressure Modi government is going to face because of the new dynamic which has been created with China and Pakistan coming together. And Pakistan, it can claim that effectively it defeated its own ally US in its own ally Afghanistan's grounds as such. So I think the big winner is Pakistan in India's context. China is a bigger winner in a larger scheme of things. And they both are going to impact Modi government. Probably their leverage has been reduced and the number of questions being asked vis-a-vis what has been going on since President Xi's visit, first visit that is, in the first Modi government. Since then, the number of questions that have arisen, not one has been resolved, and now there's less chances of any being resolved in India's favor.
How do you see India-Taliban relationship in the future?
Well, in some ways, I get a sense that Taliban is going to be more practical now than it was 20 years ago. They've learned quite a bit. They want to be relevant globally as well. So they would try to kind of improvise their own positions. They will not be as fundamentalist they were at one point in time, and we will see how the whole thing evolves as such. But it will not be as bad as it was. That much is certain. How it evolves is a question of we have to see how things unfold. So I'm not willing to basically put any bets outside the fact that Taliban won't be as fundamentalist as it was in earlier times. So probably there's a little more leeway here. Instead of just being anti-Taliban, probably in government of India will learn how to live with them in the times to come.
Shantanu, your views?
I echo very much the same perspective on this. I think that it's very clear that the Taliban has changed, at the very least, its rhetoric. And at least so far, despite the chaotic evacuation, they don't seem to be beheading people, and they seem to be, in point of fact, pardoning most former employees of the Afghanistani government. So they clearly are operating in a very different way. The supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, recently made a statement saying, this Taliban is very different than anything that came before. They're no longer beheading people. It's worth keeping in mind again that the Taliban is the sort of most rigid of all of the Sunni groups, and the Ayatollah of Iran would be the most rigid of all the Sufi groups. And these are natural enemies, regionally, as well as part of a 1,300-year-old religious conflict. And yet, they seem to be able to get along. If Ali Khamenei can get along with the Taliban, I think there's a reasonably good shot that the BJP government in India, or whatever government happens to be in power, whatever its feelings towards Salafist Islam in particular, they seem more amenable to working on a forward basis that may be mutually interesting.
Mr. Jha, my last question. My last question to you is BJP as a party seems to thrive when they have enemies around. Last time around, we know that Balakot was a major issue before the elections. Do you think having Taliban would help BJP in 2024?
Yes. If BJP didn't have an enemy, they'll invent one. In this case, something has been handed over to them. That said, I think Afghanistan will not be as big an issue as anything like Balakot. Pakistan is an issue because it's in the conscience of people, right? Afghanistan hasn't touched our conscience the same way. It cannot actually, because it's not a division of the nation. It's always existed there as a remote place as such. We think of Afghanistan in a very unique way. The Kabuliwala is the image of Afghanistan. We don't go beyond that. But Pakistan is very different. It's like you have lost one of your limbs. So a limb says, I'm independent of you. So the relationship there emotionally is very, very different. So I don't think BJP can catch Taliban at the same level, but definitely they will try to do that. And you will see the WhatsApp University of India is going to be abuzz with basically taking Taliban positions to attack the Muslims in India. Because they will say Talibans are the Sharia law. If that's what you want, so Muslims should go and live in that Sharia law. Why are you opposing them? In fact, all the opposition to change in Afghanistan that any Muslim in India has posed or talked about, they have been thrashed for that by the same logic. That, look, why don't you accept Sharia law now? You are Muslim, you are Islamist, go and accept that law. So the challenge is that conversation will happen more socially and through WhatsApp University, so to say, and probably it will impact the views of the followers of BJP, but it will not be done in the same way as the Pakistan-India relationship.
Shantanu, how do you find Joe Biden different to, say, a Trump when it comes to international relationship?
I actually think that one of the unsung stories here is that Joe Biden and Donald Trump are actually awfully similar. Joe Biden, as early as 1975 in the Senate, was opposed to giving support in Saigon during the Vietnam War. So he's been very consistent. As vice president, he was noted for wanting to withdraw from Afghanistan and Iraq. In point of fact, Mike Mullen, at the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing to confirm Mike Mullen as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mike Mullen explicitly attacked Joe Biden as vice president for wanting to withdraw. Biden has been very consistent on this. So has Donald Trump. Donald Trump, since that famous Playboy interview in the early 90s, where he set out his political views, has always said we need to stop having these foreign wars and foreign invasions. We need to get out. So I think the very interesting thing here is that both of them have turned out to be, in some ways, moderates at the foreign policy level. And it's been interesting to watch that ultimately Biden came through on the deal that Trump architected and finally got the U.S. out of this conflict.
My view is that if Donald Trump was the playboy of politics in some ways, he only took decisions based on his personal interest. You could always influence his decisions based on how you would, basically work with his team, his little Trump organization, or people who associate with it, or people around him. You could influence him through people directly appealing to Trump's personal interests. In the case of Biden, you have a long history of being senatorial about things. So you've learned how to basically look at various competing interests and then figure it out what is more reasonably saleable idea, and you work through that. So styles are very, very different. But results could be the same for a variety of reasons sometimes, but they will not be consistently the same. As regards, when I think of, I got to know the name Biden in 1984 when I first came as a Hoover Humphrey Fellow, and since then, what is the image of Biden I have? He comes across as a man who is known for his gaffes on the one hand, talks a little more than he should have, number two, very gentlemanly in the current post-vice presidential phase as such, but he has a whole history of evolution of over, say, more than 50 years as a public person in the space, particularly of foreign policy as such. So he has a definite lens, which Shantanu says from that point of view, he will be consistent along those lenses that he has. But vis-a-vis Trump had no views on anything except what is in my interest. For him, North Korea and Saudi Arabia were the two biggest stories in his presidency, outside of course, Putin as such, and China. So these were the four big stories. But look at the dimensions of North Korea, how big it became during Trump, and how he basically treated Saudi Arabia as such. So effectively, I would say that Trump was a person of my interest, and Biden is a person of what interest is going to look okay in the current context, given my own evolution. So there are two different ways of looking at it. The two may converge once in a while, but that is not a hard line that you can really draw in basically projecting the two vis-a-vis each other. That's what I'll see them. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Jha. Thank you so much, Shantanu. Thank you so much for joining me on my program.
Thank you for having us, and appreciate it. Thank you.